Okay, hey there. It looks like for the first time ever, I am actually streaming at the time I said I'd be streaming, which is 1 p.m. Pacific Standard Time, just in case you guys cared. Anyway, my name is Michael Salati. I am a developer program engineer at Google, and I specifically work on web.dev. Um, web.dev is pretty much like the your one-stop shop resource for anything and everything web dev related. We host a bunch of content covering different topics such as load times, reliability, building progressive web apps, how to improve the performance of your applications in frameworks such as React and Angular. We have a measure tool so we can run audits on your websites and provide feedback on where areas you can improve. And we host a blog where we have authors with like across Google posting content that is probably useful and helpful to you. Um, but today we're actually going to be picking up where we left off yesterday, and that's working on the newsletter page. Now, if you go into let's stay in this blog page for a second, you'll see that there's a subscribe button here, and if we click into this, it'll take you to a form that's hosted somewhere else, and you fill out the form and you subscribe to the web.dev newsletter. So about once a month we send a newsletter to you, kind of pointing you to articles of interest, and sometimes it'll include some other things in there. The problem is you can't really see past newsletters unless you had already been subscribed to the newsletter. So all the old emails we send out don't really exist anywhere else other than in people's inboxes. So what we're going to look to do is build out an area on the web.dev website where we can host all those old newsletters. Right now we have locally and live right now a page called newsletter. And here is a new form that we have. That way we don't have to direct the user off of the website. They fill out the form and they're able to sign up for the newsletter. And one additional thing we actually added was we created a way to view newsletters or host newsletters on the site. So if I add 2020-03 and click enter, this is actually the newsletter that we sent out in March of 2020. It loads in really, really well, and this is actually loaded in via an iframe because the newsletters we send out are these HTML emails, so they already have their own styling applied to it. But that styling is going to conflict with the styling we have on the website, and we don't want the newsletter to lose the look and feel that it has that when we send it out. So we actually use a really cool attribute on an iframe. So we'll inspect this element here to deepen. Scroll up. So here's our iframe, and there's actually an attribute called source doc, which allows us to dump in HTML, and the iframe will load in whatever HTML we put inside of this source doc. That way we can display the HTML in an encapsulated environment inside of the iframe, but unlike how iframes are normally used, we don't need to make an additional network request because we're not giving it a URL, we're just giving it straight HTML. So it's performant in two ways. The first one displays the stuff without displays the newsletter without any of our styling affecting it, and it doesn't require an additional network request for an HTML page that we're hosting somewhere else. But we want to be able to start to surface these newsletters that we're archiving on web.dev right here in our just newsletter path. Because it's just a form. But if you look at other places that we host stuff, like our blog, here we go. You'll see that we have these cards, and the cards have images, a little preview of the text that's going to appear here. And so we kind of want to do the same thing for our newsletter, and that's what we're going to be getting into. So let me just take a sip of my coffee and we'll get started. Okay. Let's check our code. And for those of you who are interested, the code for web.dev is actually available on GitHub. It's an open source project, so if you want to look at the code or possibly contribute to it, you can go to github.com/ I was going to write Google Chrome /web.dev. Click enter. Here's the code base. So if you guys want to dig into it, you can. But I have the code here up and running, and I actually have our local server running, which is where we looked at our newsletter page right now. Okay, so let us go to the actual page for our newsletter, and we'll start with manipulating that. All right, so the newsletter page exists in the source directory, site, content, EN for English, newsletter. Here we go. So this is the newsletter page that you guys see right now. It's just this form, and this form is included through a partial, which is pretty much just a component or a reusable part of template. The framework that we use to build out web.dev is called 11D. It's a static site generator that uses JavaScript and Nunchuck or whatever sort of other sort of templating files you want to use to generate pages in HTML. So pretty much every page you go to on web.dev is actually pre-rendered content. No JavaScript is really required in order to display the pages. So this partial subscribe is the actual form area that we see here, but we're going to want to start to add cards to the page. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to look at a page or a template that already has cards. So we saw that our blog area has cards, and I'm going to use that as a reference. Actually, I think there's an exact partial that we can look at how cards work. You know, we'll get to the cards in a second. Let's look at a simple way of just iterating and displaying the content. So in 11D, we have these data sources called collections, and collections are usually just arrays of objects that we can reference anywhere in the site. So we're gonna, oh my god, I actually really need to remember some syntax here for Nunchuck. So I'm actually gonna open up some additional code that I can reference, only because I don't remember everything off the top of my head. So we want, the reference we're going to use is, where is this? Filters includes, I'm going to open this to the side because this might be what I'm going to want to reference. No, that's not what I'm going to reference. Is this what I want to reference? Okay, yeah. So, like I mentioned, we have these objects or collections in 11D. And we have a collection right now that's called newsletters. And it's just an array of objects where each element is one newsletter. So what I'm going to do is I am going to loop over the newsletters just to display some of the content for it. I opened up this paged NGK file just because I don't remember the syntax for loop with Nunchuck. So I'm just going to be I'm going to copy this over here. So we have a 4 element in and paged elements, and elements is an array here, but that's not too big of a concern. So 4 element in paged elements, and we're going to change paged elements to collections.newsletters. That way we can just iterate over that array. And all we're going to do here is we are going to create a div and we're just going to put, oh, I locked my computer by accident. Hold on, guys. Okay, sorry about that. All we're gonna display here is just the title for every newsletter. So instead of for element in collections newsletters, we'll call it for newsletter in newsletters. And so here, you can just create a h1 tag, newsletter, title, and then close the h1 tag, and we'll save that. And so if we go back to the newsletter page, what we should end up seeing is a a bunch of H1s with the title of every newsletter, but in this case, it's only going to be one because we only have one newsletter right now. So here we are on the newsletter page. I'm going to give the page a refresh. And there we go, the March 2020 newsletter, which is what I was expecting to see. That's it for the time. But that's the only newsletter we're going to be hosting for now. Eventually we'll add all the old ones. But this isn't necessarily the prettiest way to display the March 2020 newsletter. So let's make this a little bit better. So here in this paged area, you see that we have this thing called postcard. Postcard is actually a class that we have that it pretty much generates HTML, and the HTML generated is the cards that you see on the page. So if I dig into something like the blog page, and if I inspect, let's say, this card, this card here is actually generated by that postcard class that you saw in the paged area. So you see the section class wgrid, div class wgrid columns, wgrid columns 3 row list. You can see that here also. Section class wgrid, div class wgrid columns, wgrid columns 3. So this wrapper here is the wrapper that we see here. And then this div here with the class wcard is being generated by this postcard here. So let's take the wrapper, because we're going to really want to style it and make it look like the cards that we see elsewhere on the site. And we are going to start to use that postcard element. Now, postcard takes an argument, and the argument's an object. The object is has an attribute called post, or a key called post, with the object being the element that's being passed in. I am not sure if our newsletter matches what the post is supposed to look like, but I'm just gonna save this, and then we'll dig into what the the code for the postcard actually does to see what's breaking and what we need to do to manipulate this. But let's just save that. It'll quickly rebuild. It will not rebuild. Okay. Why did this not rebuild? Error with nunchuck shortcodes postcard. Okay. So the issue that we see here is happening with this strip language filter. So I believe what's happening here is this strip language function in the postcard. The postcard actually is just a base card that we pass up. But this is throwing a hissy, and that's because the post URL probably doesn't have that language. In fact, I'm not sure if our posts actually have a URL. So let's take a look at the post to see if we actually include a URL with it. We generate the newsletters that we pass into 11D, not through our collections, but through a data object called newsletters. And what newsletters returns is a permalink, which is the full path that we're going to send the user to, some HTML, a title, the year of the newsletter, and the month of the newsletter. So we're just going to add a URL to it. And the URL is going to be almost the same as the permalink. The only other thing we're going to add to it is the language, which is going to be set to English. I'm going to save that. And I believe that would have worked, but URL. Okay, let's kill the server and run it again and see how that works. building. I believe this should actually behave appropriately, but it doesn't look like it did. Cannot read property tags of undefined. So this data tags. All right, so the next issue that we're having is that we're not passing a data attribute in the newsletter that we're passing into the base card. So it goes into the element that we post in, and I actually am just gonna fortunately keep this name post for the time being, but I want to rename this to element because element is a little bit more generic. There we go. So we don't really pass in a data field, so we're just going to do an or here. So either we're going to set this data equal to the data attribute of the element, or if there is no data attribute in the element, it's just going to be an empty object. And what ends up happening is a little bit lower, we go to the data object and we check if tags exist. If tags doesn't exist, then we pass an empty array. But the reason why that wasn't really working before is this data was actually like a null field or an undefined field. So trying to call an attribute or go into a key for it was just not going to work. So this is the area that we were throwing our next error. All right, we have our next place where something is breaking, and that is in cannot read property authors. All right, so authors is handled on line 127. Okay, so post data authors. Let's rename again. I don't like the use of post when we can avoid it because it doesn't necessarily have to be a post. So we'll have to call it element data authors. The data field should exist. So, okay. Here's what we're going to do. We're going to do this element data equals this element data if it exists. Now, I know that looks ugly, but the issue that we're going to be having, or the issue that I see coming up ahead, is we don't necessarily pass the data object into that display authors. We pass the element or the post into it. So though we might set this data to be equal to element data or an empty object, the original object of this element won't have that empty object. So that is a problem. And actually, a smarter way to do this is much the same way that we did before, this or. So we'll either assign this element data to this element data or an empty object. All right, let's save that. And so what we should see is in our render authors, we can do an or check so that we might do an empty array. Or, you know what, skip that. It wouldn't make sense to... Actually, no. So we'll do an or check where... There we go. So we'll create, if there aren't any authors, or if there is no author on the data object, we'll do, we'll just set that to an empty array. That should be authors, not author. That's good there. So over here, we pass in, the authors to this render author images function. And this render images function will check if authors is an array. If it's not an array, then we don't execute anything here. So the additional condition we're going to check is if authors length is equal to 0. In both of those cases, we're going to return. So if the data field doesn't have any authors, we have an empty array. And so if the array is empty, then we shouldn't render author names here because, or render author images here because there won't be anything here. Render author names will do much the same thing. I actually applied this to the wrong thing. Okay, so render author images won't render if the author's length is greater than 0. And I guess the next condition here is going to be if authors dot length is equal to 0. So we don't want it to return if we have more than 2 authors, or we have no authors, or if it's not an array altogether. Save that. Okay, so the render authors should now not be an issue. So let's execute the code again. Alright, this looks to be running mostly correctly. We'll see in a sec. Okay, so that seems to have built. So let's take a look at the newsletter page and see if we actually have a decent looking card. Here we go. Let's give it a refresh. And here is a card. It actually exists. There is pretty much nothing to it, but the card does actually exist. Okay, we should fix this in a lot of places. All right, let's get this resolved. All right, so the first thing we want to do is actually make sure that a title is displayed. Let's take a look at where we display the title inside of the card. So looking through the card, we have this this data title. So it looks like the title is actually associated to a data field. So we are going to we're going to move the title that we have here, this March 2020, and we are going to put it into a data field. All right, that's going to be our first little change. Also, if we're going to make this change to the newsletter object where we're putting the title inside of a data field, we should probably make that modification to the individual newsletter page as well. This might seem a little bit annoying or silly to do now, but I just think it's going to be important in order so we don't forget. So if we make a change to the data object, let's ensure that we update the template that displays the newsletter. So that's going to be our first change there, first change there. All right, what else do we actually want to display? So rendered authors and date. So we want to give the date. Newsletter is sent out on March. Was sent out in March. Okay, so we want to display that date here. So we're okay. Render authors and date takes the element object. When we render the date, the element actually has a date on it as well. So we can just create a date attribute on the object. Something that would look like this. And so this is going to be a new date object. And all right, so there's a couple of ways that we can create a date object here. So I'm actually going to look at what the date object, what arguments the date object can take in. So mdn date, because we want to generate a date that's actually like correct and based off of what we have here. So we have the year and the month, and maybe we can add a day to it. So we have a date. So let's see what arguments it can take. So it looks like we can pass into it a string. Is there anything else? Okay. Year, month index. I think month index probably won't be the best way to go. Yeah, because it's going to be 0, 2. Okay, so we can give it a year and a month, and if we want to get more specific, day and time. But what we'll do here is we will give it the year. So newsletter dot year, as well as the month. So newsletter dot month. And I am just going to jump into my email to see if I know what day that email got sent out. March. You know, I'm checking my email right now, and it looks like about an hour ago, the April newsletter got sent out. So at some point, I'm going to have to update this to include the April newsletter. But until then, let's see if I can find the March 2020th newsletter. Web.dev. All right, so the newsletter was sent out on March 30th, so we'll just also create a day field, year, month, day. All right, so now we have the date of when the newsletter was sent out. So here we now should be able to render a date and a title for the card. Let's save that and give it a rebuild and see what that looks like. That starting is, there we go, 20 seconds. Okay. I think that's more of an issue with my computer right now, but all right, let's give it a refresh. And so here we go. Now we have our date of when this was posted, March the 30th, and we have a title. And let's just inspect this, because I think before we saw that there was an issue with the URL. Yeah, so the URL is set to just, oh, that is odd. Okay, that is odd, and that does not look good. So looking at it, it looks like the URL is just set to en 2020-03. Where is, so this requires that URL field, I thought. So if I check the base card, this URL, so we have this URL that we're assigning in a few places. This URL takes the elements URL, passes it into a strip language function. And what does strip language do? So it splits it. It splits the URLs based on forward slashes. Okay. So what I believe is happening here is the URL that's being generated by this path join probably looks something like en newsletter 2020-03. Okay, so the path that is being generated for this URL probably looks something like this. And the strip language function that we have here, it looks to find, first thing it does is that it's going to split the URL based on where these forward slashes are, and then it's going to remove the first element in that. So what I believe the result looks like is something like this. Okay, and so if we hover over splice, okay, it's not saying what splice is. This is odd. Okay, here I'm gonna just add some type docking to it just so we can better understand what this is doing. All right, if I save that, now this should be marked as a URL. Okay, so what split is doing, it's separating the URL and turning this into an array. So now URL parts is an array of strings. And so what splice is going to do, it's going to remove an element from the array, and it's going to take the index, which is going to be 1, that's hard-coded in, and then it's going to remove one element. So it's going, I believe the array once split looks something like this. It's going to the first element, which is newsletter, and then it is removing newsletter. And then it takes this array and joins it back together. But if we just modified it so now we put a forward slash on English, the new split array, I believe, will look something like this, where the first element will be just an empty element or an undefined object, because it's going to remove this and like it'll be removing this one. So the second element, or the element at the one index, will be English, and then that will get removed. And then when it's rejoined, it should look like newsletter. When it gets rejoined, it should look like this, which is what we want to see. So let's remove all that, and let's just add a /en. Let's save that, and let's see if that works, because I think that will. Unfortunately, when we modify a JavaScript file in 11D, we actually have to kill and rebuild, because the only things that really rebuild are like templates. So we'll just rebuild here, and we'll see how this looks. There we go. Let's go back. Let's give this a refresh. Doesn't look like anything changes, but now if I hover over the like the newsletter element, I can see that the path is now newsletter 2020-03. And if I click into that, it'll take me to the actual newsletter. So this is starting to look a little bit better. The only other things that we can really do to make this card look nicer is to, we can add possibly a banner image over here and a description over here. But the descriptions, we're going to keep them kind of generic for the time being. The banner image will try to get to something more, the banner image will try to get to something looking a little bit better, but the description or subhead we can do something fun with. So let's go back to our base card, which is the element that we pass this into, and render subhead is going to add that little description or the subheader. So we can see that render subhead gets called over here. And what gets passed into it is the data object and specifically the field subhead. So let's just add a simple subhead to this. Can we dynamically do this? Yeah, we can. You know what? We're gonna refactor this a little bit, just because this is becoming a little bit long in the tooth, and it's gonna be harder to manipulate. So instead of spreading the newsletter into a new object and then adding fields to like listing all these additional fields to the new object. What we're going to do is we're going to just modify the original newsletter thing without creating a new object. And then return the modified newsletter. So let's take all of these fields and attributes that we are adding to the newsletter. There we go. So now we have new newsletter date we're adding. It's a date, newsletter, permalink. We're just adding all these fields to it. And what we're going to next add to this is into the newsletter.data field. We're going to add a subhead. But we're only going to add the subhead if the newsletter doesn't already have a subhead. So I would love to allow like whoever is adding a newsletter to web.dev to be able to add their own subhead if they want. But until then, we'll write a check if a user ends up doing that. So if newsletter data subhead, or actually more importantly, if no newsletter data subhead, then we are going to assign a subhead. So what will we call this? I'm actually gonna copy some text we use on other pages. So we have our latest news, updates, and stories for developers. We use this in a lot of places. So I'm actually gonna use this and I'm gonna modify it. So we'll have it say read our, and we'll put the title here. So in this case, it'll be like March 2020 newsletter. So read our March 2020 newsletter for the latest news, updates, and stories for developers. And I'll just add a little exclamation mark there for spice. So if there is no subhead defined, we are going to create a subhead for it, and it's going to say read our, whatever the title of the newsletter is, which is usually just the month, year, and then the word newsletter for the latest news, updates, and stories for developers. And we'll save that. And we'll see what that looks like in a sec. Oh, it's not going to build. I forgot that. Okay, I will run that. And while that's running, I'm going to dig into the last thing I want to make sure exists in these cards, and that's a image. That way we can use it for to make the cards look a little bit nicer. So let's click into this page. I lost it. Hold on. Come on. And unfortunately, when I started the server again, it like purged all the already built files in order to rebuild the files. So I cannot check the newsletter until after it finishes building. But there we go. Now that it's finished building, let's give it a refresh. So here is our newsletter, and we want to, what I would ideally like to do is get this like first image that we have here in our featured posts and use this image as the newsletter image. But if we can't use this, if we can't get a photo from the featured post, which we should be able to, then we'll probably end up using this image as our de facto image. Let's inspect it and see what we can get from it. So this is hosted somewhere. Services, Google, files, email, web.dev, hero, image. Let's take that and okay, so this is that. Let's save this into our actual web.dev project. That way we're not really dependent on if that image ever gets deleted or destroyed or moved or something like that. And this is our like default image if we ever lose something. So where should this go? We have podcasts. Let's create a folder called newsletter Actually, you know what? We don't need to create a folder. We'll just call the image itself newsletter, and that should fit well inside of this images folder. So now we should be able to set the image. Let's see what image is supposed to look like. So the image is the thumbnail. Where do we get the thumbnail? So thumbnail or hero comes from the data object, and then there's an alt there. So inside of our... So we'll let users potentially create their own alts and stuff. But we're gonna, okay, so newsletter data. So if there isn't a thumbnail, we're gonna assign a thumbnail. And that thumbnail will be just images newsletter dot png. The other thing we'll do is we'll add the alt for the image. So if there's no thumbnail, we're gonna add our own thumbnail, and we're gonna add an alt, and the alt is going to either be the existing alt if there is an alt, because that's not the most important thing. What's important is that there has to be an alt if there is a thumbnail. So honestly, actually, this should exist no matter what, as its own separate condition, because maybe the user might have an image, but we might have an image, but we might not have a thumbnail. We might have a thumbnail image, but we might not. We may not have a thumbnail, but we may have an alt assigned. So we'll run this as a separate check. So if there is no alt, then the alt will be we'll just use the title of the page. Newsletter data dot title. And if there's no thumbnail, we'll assign the thumbnail as this newsletter image that we kind of have assigned. But this is like a default if we can't get a banner image for it. Ideally, I want to be able to pull this image that is associated to the featured post. So let's see how featured post actually looks inside of here. So inside of the HTML for the newsletter page, we have featured posts, and then we have TR. We have a table and a row with another table, and embedded somewhere deep inside of there. Somewhere really deep. And this is why writing HTML for emails is not fun. It's because you can't really do flex or use bootstrap grid. So tables end up becoming the best solution for formatting, though it may not look fun. Okay, if we dig in really, really deep, here we actually have an image, and it actually has its own alt, has its own image. So I want to be able to get this image and extract it out. I wonder if there's an easy way to kind of find and pull that out, and I'm not sure if there is. All right, so table main Gmail2 is probably where we want to work from. Let me just see if there's table main Gmail2 is also used here. Huh. Okay, let's... It's going to be a little bit of a pain in order to extract the image out. I wonder if there's something unique about the image. All right, actually, before we get into that, let's see how we can start to extract images from this newsletter, because this is just an HTML file that we take in as a string, and then we set that string to this HTML field. Works not the best. Let's fix that up. Or actually, that we want to stay consistent. But let's see how we can actually take the string and parse out stuff. I'm gonna go into our tests, the tests that we write for the site, because there's a library that we use that makes it easy to manipulate and figure out. Makes it easy to manipulate and figure out the content of an HTML file, and that library is called Cheerio. Probably not going to be able to describe Cheerio well, so I'm just going to hit up npm and search for Cheerio so we can get a quick description of it. So Cheerio is where is it? I missed that. Okay. Cheerio is a tiny, fast, and elegant implementation of core jQuery designed specifically for the server. Pretty much what we can do is we can pass into Cheerio a string, the string being the HTML that we have, and then we have a jQuery object, or kind of like a pseudo jQuery object that we can use to find elements. So here's an example. They pass in just some HTML as a string, $, like you would have in jQuery, and then as $, they have the query selector and they get the values from it. So this is what we're going to use in order to find elements in our, to find the elements. Okay, let's copy this. And right inside of newsletter here. So the newsletter HTML is still kind of important. And here's our thumbnail condition. So if there is no thumbnail, we want to get the thumbnail. And we'll do that by creating a new Cheerio object where we're going to pass into it a string. The string is the HTML of the page. And so what I should be able to do here is, let's say, $ image. So what does this return? Selector Cheerio static. I wonder if this is only returning one object rather than every object. Let's see. I think it's going to return just one object at a time. Method for getting a value. Alright. Let's see if they have an equivalent to a query selector or... Alright, so if we give it a selector as a string, DOM element, or array of DOM elements, the selector method is the starting point for traversing and manipulating the document like jQuery. It's a primary method for selecting elements in the document. But unlike jQuery, it's built on top of CSS selector library, which implements most. I'm not sure exactly what's going to be returned here. So we'll do a check. Console log type of to see what this actually returns. Or the type of data object it's going to return. However, if it's an array, it might just return like object. So we'll do an isArray check to see if the object is an array, if it says just object. And finally, I'm just going to console log the result of this query selector as well. All right, so let's save all that. Okay, this, I can probably comment that up. Comment this line out for the time being, only because this is too much data to parse through. So files change. Okay, so it is an object, but it is not the image. So it's only returning the first result. Or it's most likely returning only the first result, which is problematic. So let's go to the repository and see if we can see if there's a way that I can get all of the images rather than just like one image. in JavaScript, like pure JavaScript, it would be something like query selector all. Oh my god. Okay, so just for me, it's personally a little funny because I found this issue because this M. Reinstein actually is someone I used to work with, Mike Reinstein. At some point, I'll have to mention that I found this issue, though it may not be what is actually going to help me here. It's fun that I found this issue from Mike. Okay. Is there another way I can do this? With some selectors. Selector after nth does not match. With jQuery or Cheerio, he gets none. Salt data. Okay, I'm not sure. I think I have a potential solution as to how we can hack this together. All right, let's see how we can do this. So we can take the Cheerio object and search for the actual image we want. So an image should have an attribute. So is there an... Oh, what's the thing to get an exact attribute in Cheerio? Is it attribute or is it get? Do I use it here? Yeah, okay, ATTR will get the attribute. So the attribute we want to get from an image is a source. And so we'll do let image equals. Okay, so let image equal an image selector, and we'll do a while loop that this is going to iterate while image exists. Next thing we'll do is console log image attribute source. So we're just going to log out all the sources here, see what that looks like. And then can I remove an element? Let's see if there's a way I can remove an element from the parsed HTML that Cheerio provides. Okay, so we got load. That brings it in. Parse DOM. Nope, that's still part of the load. There's a remove attribute. There's add class, remove class. Doesn't look like there's... Oh. Okay, so there's a find. Get descendants of each element in the current set that matched elements. This might be more along the lines of what we want. So let's say if we got the body element and we want to find inside of the body element all of the images. All right, const images. And next thing we should be able to do, this is going to return, we'll see what this returns. Is there a way we can quickly iterate through it so we can get the length? I'm wondering if this is actually going to return this array that we want, or some sort of iterable object. So console log type of images, and if it's an array, I think returns as an object, or type of as an object. So we'll just do a check to see. No. Still returning an object, is not an array. Let's see what images actually looks like. Okay, so I think it is an iterable only because I did see the length attribute. My god. Okay. It looks like it's an object where each image has the attribute of a number, which is like where in the array or where in the object, like its key value. So let me just check what the keys of the object are, and if I see the numbers, then I know that I'm working with the right thing, because it's a little too hard to search through it all. Okay, so here we go. We have 0 through 29. Those are our keys. So, and if we do console log images dot length, just because length is an object that we have here. I am 30. Yeah, that looks right. Is this, what sort of data object is this? How do I do a check if something is an iterable? JS check if iterable. Checking where something is an iterable. Return type of object symbol iterator. All right, let's see if this is an iterable. And that will save me a little bit of headaches, because if it is an iterable, I can just pass into, like, or get an array from it, most likely. Otherwise, it'll be a fun and interesting hacky solution. Okay, it's not necessarily an iterable. If I do array from, or hold on, array dot of images, and of returns a new array from a set of elements. Let's see what that looks like. Yeah, that's not the way to go. Okay, we're gonna take a fun, interesting, hacky-ish solution to this. So for let I equals 0, and where I is less than or equal to images length, which tells us how many elements are in the images, we will run this for loop. And so what we'll do here is console log images I think that'll be interpreted into a string. Type tag name this namespace attributes. Let's save this and see what we got here. So this is looping through the objects until we get to undefined. Interesting. Console log images, as long as images is less than the length, not less than or equal to. Data parent type, we don't need the parent information. We just need to see if we can get the source from the image. So let's get the attributes. See what this looks like now. All right, so there's our attributes, and let's get the source of the image. This I might have to kill it and rebuild it, and we'll see. Oh, no. Okay. Where is this? What? Okay, so this is starting to look right. So here are all the images that we have, and it's actually a lot more than I thought I would want. Let's get the attributes as well and see if there's a way that we can determine if this is an image we actually want to use. Nope. Let's check these again. It's the alt that we want, but let's see if there's anything specific to this image that makes it unique and easier to grab. There is a link to it. That's nothing too specific. The alt is there. The width is assigned. So, that's not really going to help us. I don't know if there's any way to distinguish the actual elements here. Tip. Does this have an alt? Yes, just tips. I don't know if there's a good way to ensure that we're extracting this element. Unless there's a way to... Is there something special about featured posts that I can use this as the start? Is there anywhere else that pad top B20 is used? Because this actually might be something specific and useful to determining if we are grabbing elements inside of this table here, which hosts the featured posts. Okay, so let's take a look at an example of a newsletter. This is the actual HTML. Let's see if pad top B20 is used anywhere else. Pad top B20, I think the first place it ends up getting used is, what is this? No, there's possibly nothing specific or unique about it, but I believe this is where so this is where featured posts begins. So let's modify our newsletter query so we get something a little bit more specific. So we'll go into where pad top B20 is, and we'll just get those images. There we go. So now we've dug in just a little bit more specifically. So the first image that we have is an NFC device. Let's see what that looks like. Yeah, so you guys might not be able to see that, but that was actually the right image. It opened up in a different tab. Here we go. So this is the actual image we want. So that B20 thing was actually a really good place to work from. I don't know if I like using that, but I'm gonna use this for the time being, and then we'll probably have to have a discussion of a better way to extract that. So, okay, so what we can do here is we can start to write our little conditions. All right, what are our conditions that we're going to be checking for? So let's first check if images length is greater than 0. So make sure there's at least one element in the image's length. All right, that's a good place to start from. Next thing we'll do is if the image's length is greater than 0, then we know that there are images in that like featured post area. So we will we'll use those images. So here, let's create a variable called thumbnail, and we'll we don't need to create a variable called thumbnail. We'll do this here. Okay, so if there is no thumbnail, we will set the default thumbnail and alt tag to images newsletter PNG, and the alt tag to be the title of the the newsletter. Next thing we'll do is we'll use Cheerio to take the newsletter HTML, and we will find all the image tags inside of this pad top, inside of the element that matches or has a class of pad top b20, which should take us straight into that featured post area. If there are images in that, if the image's length is greater than 0, we are going to use the first image and the first alt associated with it. So we'll set that there, and so we will also need to. So we're going to reassign the thumbnail and the alt to the images at index 1 or index 0. My bad. And we'll get the attributes. And we'll get the source for the thumbnail and the alt for the image. And so now if I save that, let's see what that looks like. All right, that's overwriting. I'm gonna have to kill and rebuild real quick. Just patiently waiting. Okay. Let's go back and let's give this a refresh. Okay, so here we have our newsletter. The alt tag was actually applied interact with NFC devices on Chrome for Android, but the image itself isn't actually correct, and I think I know what is causing that. So you can see here that the image URL is ending up being relative. Like here's the HTTPS service, blah, blah, blah. So the image is relative to the path or where it's going to end up being. So we're going to just, we'll look into the code to see where that actually takes place, because that's something we're going to want to modify and to take into account. All right, so let's see where that image is added to the card. Render chips, render data, render blah, 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 blah. Okay, so we have render thumbnail here. And what render thumbnail does is it will join the URL, which is the current path to the image. Here's something we can do. We can possibly not do that if the image is an absolute URL. So if the HTTPS is already included with it. So this we can do with regex. So what I think we would want is image. We should actually say that this is going to be a string, so I can get some type hinting here. So URL is a string. Image, which is actually just the image path, is a string. And alt is a string. So if I do image dot match, let's see what match does. Match will match a string with the regex expression. What does it? It doesn't really. Dot includes. Does includes take regex? No, it takes a search string. I think maybe match is the way to go. Okay, I think match is the way to go. And so we're gonna write a regex check. Let's just do a quick Google search on regex. Regex tester. I want to actually make sure I'm writing something that's valid. So we might have a URL that looks like this. We might have a URL or an image that looks like this, or we might have an image that looks like this. So the check we're going to want to do is to see if it's an HTTP. It can be optionally with an S. and then forward slash forward slash. The only other thing I want to do here is just to make sure that this match occurs at the beginning of the string. I don't want to necessarily find like an HTTPS in the middle or the end of the string, because if that's the case, that's not really a like an absolute path. That's just a weird path inside of there. So regex match string not containing. Check if a string only contains match elements of the URL. Validate empty string. Match valid host name. Match valid host name URL. What is this? No. So we're just gonna do. I think to check at the beginning of the string. Is it this? No. Also, escaping characters is important. We'll just do a Google search. Regex ensure beginning of line. There we go. Okay, so yeah, no, it was the up caret, upward facing caret, which is this is right, because this is the first. This is the beginning of this text area, so this is the area that we actually want to match. So let's copy that. And so we'll write our match here. So if image matches this condition, then we're just going to use the image as it is, because there's no need to join it with an apps with the URL. But if it doesn't match that, then it's not an absolute like image path, and so we're going to want to join it with the URL. So set that there, save that. This I'm going to have to start and rebuild, but ideally this should work, and we should see the image there. All right, let's go back to our newsletter page, give it a refresh. And there we go. We have the March 2020 newsletter. The image is abstracted from the newsletter. The title is a fixed title. The date is correct. And we have little content here. If we click into it, it'll actually take you to the page so you can see the newsletter. So this is definitely us going in the right path. I think this is where I'm going to call it. I'm going to probably have to polish this up before I do anything for submitting it to web.dev and having this merged in. So I hope you guys like this video or like this stream, found it useful at all at looking at how we build web.dev. Until next time, I'll probably be streaming again next Tuesday. I think moving forward, my goal is to be streaming web.dev coding on Tuesdays and Thursdays. If you haven't already, check out my YouTube channel. Feel free to subscribe, because like I said, I'll be posting these live streams or hosting these live streams there, but I'm also going to be starting to post hopefully once a week a video addressing like different things in computer science or web programming. So I actually earlier today uploaded a 6.5-minute video about insertion sorts. So I'm starting a series on algorithm design and analysis. So hopefully you guys will find that useful. Anyway, have a great day, and I'll see you next time.